Greetings to our audience. Welcome to the ICAS Expert Voices Initiative. My name is Yilun Zhang. I am the Research Associate and Manager of the Trade and Technology Program at ICAS. The ICAS EVI is a series of sit-down, on-camera interviews with top experts in field related to the U.S China bilateral relationship. And today, we have Professor William Vogt from Georgetown University to talk about the foundations of China's internet. Welcome, Professor Vogt.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Vogt is an adjunct professor of communication, culture, and technology at Georgetown University and has published articles on modern China and the impact of information technology in emerging market countries. He is the former founder and managing principal of William Polder Global Consulting, a firm which facilitated client engagement with senior business leaders in mainland China. Professor Vogt is a two-time graduate of Georgetown University with a bachelor's from the School of Foreign Service and a master from the Communication, Culture, and Technology program. At Georgetown, he founded and led the university's New Media in Asia Research Group and studied at Capital University of Economics in Beijing. He is also the author of the newly published book, The Foundation of the China's Internet. The view he presents today are solely his own and do not reflect those of any company, government, or other entities. Now, Professor Vogt, let me start our discussion with a very bottom-up question. What do you think is the utility of examining China's various cultural and conceptual calculations with regard to the internet? Basically, what really motivates you to dive into this research topic in particular? And could you help us to lay down the foundation of our following discussion to list out the major actors in China's internet environment?
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me. It's an honor to be here. Talking about such an important topic. I believe that looking at the internet in China is central to understanding modern China and by extension the world today, because as we all know, the internet is a centerpiece of online and offline life. And the Chinese internet in particular is unique in that it is, in my view, separate from the rest of the world's internet in terms of platforms and usage and culture and policy. And we have to understand this uniqueness to understand modern China due to the tight relationship, as I mentioned, between technology and society. And this relationship has been particularly emphasized in China amongst policymakers within the Chinese Communist Party. In terms of how I got into this fascinating and multidisciplinary topic, I came across it through two means. One, I had early exposure to Chinese language training, starting in high school, continuing through college. As Yilun mentioned, I studied abroad in Beijing. I also did a short-term program in Nanjing. So I had some exposure to the language, a little bit to the culture. And then at the same time, I came of age during the Arab Spring, which was a moment where a lot of scholars and pundits believed that the internet was going to be this great liberalizing influence and that was going to lead to lasting revolutionary change. Now, in the case of the Middle East, for example, that is not what happened. And a side story of that period was the so-called or fear of the Jasmine Revolution affecting China's political stability. So I really started looking at those questions, wanted to get a sense of why China was different in not only its perception of events like the Arab Spring, but also its response and its effectiveness in the response. So if you look at those two courses of study at the same time, that's a big part of kind of what I bring scholarship-wise and is a big source of my passion in this area.
And with regard to those major actors, when you say the Chinese perspective to these various events, what are the specific actors you're talking about? Is that the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government at large, or the Chinese general public?
Sure. I categorize Chinese internet actors into four buckets. The first, of course, being the state, who runs the state, the Chinese Communist Party, but also looking at kind of the day-to-day bureaucratic management of the online system. And I think the best way of encapsulating that is looking at entities like internet service providers, or ISPs, which are run primarily through state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. And those state-owned enterprises make up a very significant portion of China's economy. There's also the netizen or online citizen population to consider. Those demographics are changing now as the internet becomes more of an established commodity and as more digital natives reach adulthood. But there still are some demographic questions and problems to consider, namely the rural-urban divide, in which city dwellers have much more access to fast and reliable internet connectivity than those in the countryside, kind of skewing what the netizen population is able to express in terms of needs and grievances. In terms of grievances in particular, I think it's important to look at journalists and citizen reporters who are fighting for pieces of accountability within society. And they, in turn, kind of promote a more or less a freer, not necessarily free and open, internet where needs can be met through digital platforms. And I spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about some of the interplay between journalists and the state that goes on in order to achieve such limited but meaningful accountability. And then finally, there's, of course, the private corporations that are creating these platforms that we know and love and use. This is the case both in China and in the West and around the world. But in China, these institutions essentially created the features that have allowed for the vision of the Chinese internet to come into fore. And of course, that is a big topic to consider now, given relatively recent crackdowns of the tech industry. And perhaps what we may be seeing is kind of a pullback from those crackdowns.
So that seems like a very dynamic institution you're talking about. So let's go. You mentioned that there are journalists fighting for freer flow of information, freer space to speak up. And you also mentioned that there's recent crackdowns on big technology firms or internet service providers, per se. So this kind of reflects a lot of Westerners' perspective when, when they were mentioned about Chinese internet, that censorship is the first thing that came to their mind. What is your general assessment of that? Do you think that, censorship is a good characteristic of the Chinese internet? And, is that general understanding about Chinese internet sufficient enough for the Westerners to understand how this complex other side of the moon, so to speak, works? How complex is that really is, and how does that actually work internally?
Sure. Well, I don't make value judgments about a lot of what I see just because of some of the cultural differences and sensitivities involved. So I personally don't believe in internet censorship, but I do understand why it exists in the Chinese system. And part of that just has to do with concerns about political stability. And we do see consistently on the Chinese internet periods of bubbling resentment that can become out of hand in a way that's just reflective of a netizen population that is just so much larger and has more grievances and expectations than we might see in the West, even in large countries like the United States. So I do, see why that would be a calculation that both the government and I would say certain netizens and citizens would make in order to kind of maintain a sort of peaceful development. And that is actually the core behind a lot of netizen grievances is expectations of benefiting from economic development. So it's not necessarily a rage against the system, more just a campaign for certain tangible outcomes. But that said, censorship is pervasive on the Chinese internet, and a lot of the technical innovations that have come about, namely things like the Great Firewall, those innovations in kind of broader cybersecurity, if you will, are very much promoted by the state and used in what I would call the censorship regime. It's more comprehensive than just looking at some keywords and blocking them. It's creating a whole mechanism of control that requires a balancing act between promoting enough innovation to create those tools from the private companies that I mentioned, and cracking down so that there's not too many options in the system.
So you just mentioned private companies. How would you describe the roles of these private companies specifically then? Because as you said, there are a lot of censorship and there are a lot of crackdowns over these private companies, and there are a lot of grievances among Chinese netizens who simply see some of those internet service providers as laptops of the government. Would you agree with that assessment specifically? And more broadly, what do you think the role can these Chinese internet giants play in shaping the environment of the Chinese internet regime? And where do you see them headed in the future, given that there are more and more potential control over the internet in the future?
Well, I think we're at an interesting moment when looking at the role of these private companies, because as I said, there has been crackdowns against kind of their growth, expansion, and their success in many different products, not just censorship related, but also importantly in e-commerce and payments and business transactions, and we now see that there may be some pulling back from that from policymakers. And it's really interesting to see what is going to happen next in terms of what the role of these private companies are going to be. Because in the kind of general view of the Chinese internet and how private companies act as actors, they're the ones producing the products that are used to create this accessible internet. They're creating the interfaces that we use. Tencent creates and updates WeChat. So when there's a crackdown on a company like Tencent, that's going to impact what WeChat as a product looks like and how it's going to develop. And this kind of gets into some of the, I guess you could call it crowding out of state influence and the innovation dilemma that has perennially existed in China, because the government steps in and limits the options through which these companies can kind of create new products and implement them and actually use them and sell them and make money. And that also goes against some of the reform and opening style economic liberalization that motivates these companies just as for-profit actors.
So you're suggesting that basically, even though the Chinese government has continuous commitment to reform and opening up and peaceful development, because of these recent actions, they are more of a counterproductive actions? Or do you think there's still space left for continuous development and economic boom or innovation in this sense?
I think the Xi Jinping government is trying to calculate that, because it's not a business-friendly government. There's been a lot written out there about how business-unfriendly some of these policies, like the tech crackdown, are. And at the same time, there is this state emphasis on information technology for purposes that lie outside of the economy. But in a capitalist system and in the reform and opening system that benefited China through growth, that the economic profits fueled some of the technical development that is used by entities like the state. So I think that there is the Xi Jinping government sees that there needs to be some sort of balancing act, but they're certainly leaning away from kind of that reform and opening capitalist point of view.
So let's pull in the United States right now. You mentioned that the Xi Jinping government, the Chinese government, needs to do some calculation to balance out the goal to pursue internal control and the goal to promote innovation and development. And with this mounting rhetoric about the U.S. China technology and economic competition going on. First of all, could you give me a general assessment? Do you see that the Chinese, like prior to these crackdowns, continuous crackdowns, would you say that there's very little difference between the Chinese model and the American model when it comes to promoting e-commerce, digital economy, this and that? Or would you say that, because of those years of committed reform and opening up, China may actually take a lead because it's booming social media platforms and various e-commerce and digital economy activities?
I don't think there's a lead per se. I think there's just different forms of development. We have in China more politically negotiated standards, the state taking a much bigger role in using cybersecurity products. For China, the cybersecurity products that go into, say, the censorship mechanisms behind WeChat posts are, very much state-driven and policy-driven, whereas here in the United States, a lot of cybersecurity products are geared towards private entities, companies and individuals. You don't see as much of that type of advertising in the China space that you do in the U.S., where you get literally bombarded with it nowadays. I just saw an ad for LifeLock, for example, to protect your identity. Those are concerns that the government takes on and says this is important, and this is why we have this, maybe draconian censorship platform. It's to protect your identity, or presumably that's the message that goes out, but it's more state-focused and top-down and centralized, which, as I mentioned, does have some implications for innovation because you don't have the same levels of competition. You really only have one voice of demand.
Oh, and let's talk about people then. You mentioned that netism actually is a part of is part of this China's internet ecosystem, right? And there are a lot of Chinese netism who actually look across the Pacific and see that in the West there are a lot of social activism online. Some of them left very strong mark on the society. They push forward for social reforms. Some of them push forward for political reform, as you mentioned. Potentially, that's what they expected back in the days in the Arab Spring, and potentially that's what people expected during the Jasmine Spring. Sorry. But we see that during COVID time there were cases as well in China, despite the fact that some of the protests and these criticism has been quickly censored by the government or by these platform service providers. There are still cases like Dr. Li Wenliang being called up to the police, and then his passing later on turned him into somewhat a whistleblower martyr. And there were Chinese netizens complaining online, protesting online during Shanghai's mass lockdown, which by some view they see it as some kind of driving force that pushed for China's eventual decision to open up from its 3-year-long lockdown. So how would you assess that the internet, the role of the internet in pushing forward for China's social reform and potentially political reform at this stage?
Well, the way I see it, and the way that a lot of scholars, Guobin Yang in particular, focus on activism and the internet, is really that in China it's about small, localized, achievable goals. So even though there was a lot of high-profile reporting, at least here in the West, about the COVID lockdown protests, really it was targeted. Those protests were targeted towards the actual lockdown. Some of them morphed into something greater, but in terms of what was actually achieved and achievable, and the thrust behind it was, ending the lockdown. In other aspects throughout the past few decades that the internet has really existed as a common platform, we see time and time again how in China there are issues that come up at a very local level that expose certain areas like corruption and create opportunities for some meaningful change that isn't necessarily broad-based politically. And this is where some of the role of journalism and citizen reporters comes into play, because there is, the ability to negotiate what kind of coverage can go out in the Chinese internet, what kinds of reactions are possible, and then even within the system, the Chinese government supports what certain scholars would refer to. Jonathan Hassett, for example, talks a little bit about the idea of safety valves and pressure cookers on the Chinese blogosphere. And the idea of the safety valve in this case is to kind of give netizens the opportunity to vent about certain grievances that may be quite serious, but don't reach the level of kind of sustained collective action against core regime priorities. And that's where you saw some of the backlash to some of these COVID protests come, is when there was talk more about the regime and getting rid of Xi Jinping. That's when it kind of went too far on those boundaries. But in terms of what was actually accomplished, the core grievance was to get rid of the lockdowns, and that's what happened. So it's in some ways, I think, encouraging for activist communities abroad, because there are avenues to have some change. It's just not going to be this kind of overall revolutionary fervor. This isn't a time when we're going to see a May 4th movement, for example, and it's also not, it's also a time where Arab Spring, concepts are still very relevant.
So would you say that there may come to a point that when trying to understand the Chinese netizens' perceptions and trying to interpret these things, there might be a misunderstanding among the Western observers? Because as you mentioned that, during COVID, I still recall that many of those mainstream Western news medias like the BBC, like the New York Times, it's kind of almost like a fashionable way to track down what these netizens talk about on the internet and somehow tie it into a bigger picture about, sentiments or, dissent against the central government, that type of thing. Would you say that it is still a valuable way of understanding what the general Chinese public view on issues, including, on the U.S. China related issues, when they quote a lot of wolf warrior type netizen comments trying to show how China has grown increasingly nationalistic? Would you say that there's still some value in understanding or recording, tracking these issues? Or would you say it's generally more of a misleading or an overshoot trying to understand what the Chinese general public view online is?
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why I decided to teach my course and write this book, because I think there's a lot of nuance that gets lost, and there are a lot of well-intended but very enterprising media outlets that they want to see that spark that might completely change things and then have the scoop on that story, which again, that goes back to looking at the Arab Spring and the Jasmine Revolution, their aftermath, and I think there needs to be a more realistic understanding of that. That said, I think when looking at specific concerns, some of the acknowledgement of netizen feelings can be quite useful. I think a good example is the role that youth are playing in society today, especially economically. This idea of, say, lying flat in the midst of one of the worst unemployment crises that's kind of hit the Chinese economy in a long time. I think that example really shows, again, it's a localized issue. It touches a lot of people, but it's not the kind of thing that's going to overthrow the government, but it's also a concern. The government is concerned about this, and it does have to make that calculation again of how much the state is kind of getting involved and maybe crowding out the economy.
Since you brought up news, I personally know a bunch of youth, the millennials born after 2000. They are actually being very active online, and a very interesting field that they've been particularly interested are they're trying to, in their own words, protect their country, pass on the truth, what they perceive as the truth in the West. So we see in recent years there are, including Chinese government officials, like foreign ministry officials, and Chinese individuals registering on Western social media platforms, trying to pass on what they perceive to be the truth, trying to pass on what the Chinese believes. Would you say that that is how would you assess that trend? Do you think that is a good way to promote mutual understanding between China and the United States, especially given this very tenuous relation at this moment? Or would you say that it is just like someone else said, that they are just more of a propaganda agent trying to pass on false information to the U.S.?
Yeah, I think it can be helpful. But again, just looking at the demographics of the netizenry, who are the folks that are going to be engaging in this? These are people who presumably know foreign languages, especially English, probably have studied abroad, have some sort of grasp or fondness for international cultural ideas, particularly Western cultural ideas, and that's a useful perspective. I think China is such a big topic and a big space that I believe there's kind of room for everyone in terms of perspectives to get to the truth. So I think it's useful to hear from somebody who's a maybe more worldly Chinese citizen. I think it's helpful to hear perspectives of folks in the countryside who are, connecting on WeChat for the first time. And I think it's also can be helpful to hear from folks like myself who have an outsider's perspective and have different biases. So I think it's one piece of a larger puzzle, and I think what is what's missing is getting those last mile connections, so that we can really see what the scope of the netizenry is all about. Because there are netizens out there who are not posting grievances. They're trying to, sell their crops. And that's a very different perspective, and there's going to be very different forms of activism that come out of that than some of the more worldly and, globally educated perspectives that I think we see more frequently.
So would you consider that currently most of the information online are to be considered as too elite-ish, so that people don't really see the full picture of China, especially rural Chinese? Even the fact that they were actually given internet access and they're posting some things on domestic Chinese internet, would you consider that part to be an important piece of the puzzle for the Westerners to get a full understanding of China? Do you think that there can be a platform like that in the future to help promote the connection between China and the West in that regard?
I think from a Western point of view, that sounds very good. When looking at the Chinese internet, though, it's a very isolated space. China has a history of isolationism. I fear that is the direction that the Xi government may be going towards. So I wonder if there's going to be that opportunity to get that kind of data. And data is an important part of this research puzzle. Because in the China space, sometimes it can be very difficult to get the data you need to make those research conclusions. And I fear that this particular situation might be one in which some data might be withheld or otherwise hard to find.
Thank you. I think this is a very comprehensive and fruitful discussion today. Thank you so much again, Professor Vogt. And this concludes our EVI today. And for more on our EVI program and about the Institute for China American Studies, please visit our website and have a good day.